The terminal lights above me hummed softly, casting a pale glow over rows of empty seats. I had been standing near Gate B12 for nearly an hour, watching families reunite one after another. A young man ran toward his mother with a laugh. Two little girls wrapped their arms around their grandfather's legs. A couple kissed like they had been apart for years, and I kept looking at the sliding doors, waiting. My son had invited me for Thanksgiving dinner. He had insisted, actually. Said it had been too long since the family sat at the same table, so I had bought the ticket. Packed a small suitcase, even wrapped the gifts for the kids, but now the doors kept opening, and every time they did, it was someone else's family, not mine. Then my phone buzzed in my hand. For a second, I smiled. Finally. I unlocked the screen expecting Daniel's name. But it wasn't a message. It was a photo. My son's dining room table filled the screen, warm light plates piled high with turkey and stuffing glasses lifted mid-toast. Tracy was smiling. The kids were leaning toward the center of the table, and above the photo in Daniel's caption were 4 simple words: "Full house, full hearts." A woman sitting 2 seats away glanced up from her laptop when she heard my quiet breath catch. She followed my gaze to the phone in my hand, then quickly looked away again as if she had accidentally walked into a private moment. I stared at the photo a little longer. Then I locked the screen. I didn't call. I didn't text. I simply slipped the phone back into my coat pocket and looked once more at the doors that had stopped opening for me. Because in that moment, standing in the middle of the Denver airport with my suitcase beside me, I understood something that would quietly change everything that came after. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Eleanor Mitchell. I'm 68 years old, and until that evening at the airport, I believed I understood exactly where I belonged in my son's life. 3 days earlier, Daniel had called me. "Mom," he said, cheerful in the way people sometimes are when they're multitasking, "you should come out for Thanksgiving this year. The kids would love it." I remember standing in my kitchen in Madison, Wisconsin, the phone tucked between my shoulder and ear while I dried a dish. "You're sure?" I asked. "Of course," he said quickly. "It'll be nice to have everyone together." It had been almost a year since I'd seen them in person. Between school schedules, work, and life in general, visits had slowly become phone calls, then texts, then occasional holiday conversations. So when Daniel invited me, I didn't hesitate very long. I booked the flight that same afternoon. The airline ticket alone cost more than I like to spend these days, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that I would be there when Nathan and Lily ran into the kitchen to see their grandmother. What mattered was sitting at the table while Daniel carved the turkey the way his father used to. The night before my flight, I wrapped the kids' presents, small things I knew they'd like. Nathan loved science kits lately, and Lily had been talking about drawing. I packed them carefully into my suitcase along with a sweater Tracy once complimented. Then the next morning, I drove to the airport, boarded the plane, and watched Wisconsin disappear beneath a blanket of clouds. The flight to Denver was quiet. Most of the passengers were traveling for the holiday too, couples holding hands, parents explaining the meaning of Thanksgiving to bored children. I spent most of the flight imagining the dinner table waiting for me. When we landed, I texted Daniel. "Just arrived." He didn't answer right away, but that didn't worry me. Airports were busy places on holidays. People got distracted. I collected my suitcase and followed the signs toward baggage claim. Around me, families were already reuniting. A man lifted his little boy onto his shoulders. A grandmother cried into her daughter's arms. Every few minutes, the sliding doors opened as more passengers spilled into the terminal. I stood near the wall, scanning faces. Daniel had told me he'd pick me up. "Heads up when you land," he'd said on the phone earlier that week. "I'll swing by the airport." So I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Families kept walking through the terminal. Suitcases rolled across the floor. Laughter echoed near the exit doors. People hugged each other and disappeared into the parking lot outside. And I kept looking at the doors, waiting. Before I continue, though, I'd love to know something. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about complicated families and the quiet decisions that change lives, consider subscribing to the channel. Now, back to the moment that started all of this. I texted Daniel again. "I'm at baggage claim." Still nothing. I tried calling once, but the call rang until it went to voicemail. Around me, the crowd thinned, suitcases rolled away, laughter faded down the hallways. Even the announcements over the speakers seemed quieter as evening settled into the airport. By the time nearly an hour had passed, there were only a handful of travelers left near the carousel. That was when my phone buzzed. And I thought finally my son remembered. But instead of a message, I saw that photo. Daniel's dining room table, turkey already carved, the kids already eating, and those 4 words glowing quietly beneath the image. Full house, full hearts. For a few seconds after I saw the photo, I simply stood there with the phone in my hand. If you had been standing there in that moment, seeing that photo after flying across the country, how would you have felt? Tell me in the comments. And if this story already has you thinking about family in a new way, don't forget to like the video. The airport had grown strangely quiet around me. Most of the passengers from my flight had already left, and the echo of rolling suitcases faded into the long corridors beyond baggage claim. I looked down at the image again. Daniel sat at the head of the table. Tracy was pouring something into a glass beside him. Nathan leaned halfway out of his chair, laughing at something Lily had said. It was a warm picture, the kind of picture families post when everything feels complete, and I wasn't in it. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and rested my hand on the handle of my suitcase. For a moment, I considered calling again, but I didn't, because there are certain realizations that arrive quietly without needing confirmation. Standing there beneath the bright lights of the terminal, I had the strange feeling that if I called, I would only hear explanations I didn't really want to listen to. So instead, I turned and began walking toward the exit. Outside the sliding doors, the evening air felt colder than I expected. The sky above the parking lots had already turned the deep blue that comes just before night settles fully in. Cars pulled up and drove away in a steady rhythm, families climbing into back seats, suitcases lifted into trunks. I stood there for a minute watching them. Then I started walking. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I only knew that I wasn't ready to sit back down inside that terminal and wait for something that clearly wasn't coming. The road that curved away from the airport was lined with dim streetlights and long stretches of quiet pavement. My suitcase wheels hummed softly behind me as I followed the sidewalk along the edge of the road. After a while, I saw a small neon sign glowing ahead. Diner. The windows were fogged slightly from the warmth inside, and through the glass I could see a few people sitting at booths. Nothing fancy, just the kind of roadside place where coffee cups never seem to empty, and the menus have the same laminated pages they've had for years. I pushed the door open. A small bell above the frame chimed as I stepped inside. The warmth wrapped around me immediately. Only a handful of tables were occupied. A man in a trucker jacket sat at the counter watching a football game on a small television. 2 older women shared a booth near the back, their heads bent together in conversation. The smell of coffee and baked bread hung in the air. A waitress looked up from behind the counter and smiled in the casual, tired way people often do at the end of a long shift. "Evening," she said. "Happy Thanksgiving." "Happy Thanksgiving," I replied. She gestured toward an empty booth near the window. "Sit wherever you like." I slid into the booth and rested my coat beside me. Through the window, I could see the faint glow of headlights moving along the distant highway. The waitress returned with a coffee pot and filled the mug that had already been waiting on the table. "You traveling?" she asked. "Yes," I said after a moment. She nodded as if that explained everything. "Well," she said, setting the pot back on the counter, "kitchen's still open if you're hungry." I glanced down at the menu but didn't read much of it. "Do you have pumpkin pie?" I asked. She smiled. "Of course we do. It's Thanksgiving." A few minutes later, she brought out a small plate with a slice of pie and a spoonful of whipped cream leaning gently against the crust. The pie wasn't fancy. The crust was slightly uneven and the whipped cream had already started to soften, but it smelled warm and familiar. I picked up the fork and took a bite. The pumpkin filling was sweet and smooth with just enough cinnamon to linger after the taste faded. For a moment, I closed my eyes. I couldn't remember the last time I had eaten pumpkin pie that I hadn't baked myself. Every Thanksgiving for years, I had been the one standing in the kitchen early in the morning, mixing the filling, rolling out the crust, checking the oven again and again while the house filled with that same warm scent. I had always made 2 pies, one for the table, and one extra because Daniel liked to take a slice home. I took another bite. It might have been the best slice of pie I'd had in years, not because it was perfect, but because for once, I hadn't baked it for anyone else. Through the window beside my booth, cars continued to pass along the road. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of families inside them, children leaning against windows, parents talking softly in the front seats as they drove home from dinner. The waitress came by again and refilled my coffee without asking. "You waiting for someone?" she said kindly. I hesitated. "No," I answered. She nodded once and moved on. I sat there for a long time after finishing the pie, my hands wrapped around the warm mug of coffee. My phone remained silent on the table. No calls, no messages, just the quiet glow of the screen reflecting the soft lights of the diner. Eventually, I picked it up again and opened the photo Daniel had posted. The same image filled the screen. The turkey, the glasses raised mid-toast, the smiles around the table, and the caption, "Full house, full hearts." I studied the picture for another moment. Then I locked the phone and slipped it back into my purse. By then, the realization had settled fully in. No one was coming, and no one had ever planned to. I paid for the pie and coffee with a few folded bills from my wallet. The waitress thanked me and wished me a safe trip the way people do when they sense a traveler passing through. I smiled politely, gathered my coat and suitcase, and stepped back outside into the cold evening air. The sky had gone fully dark now. The quiet road near the diner was lit only by scattered streetlights, and the distant hum of traffic rolled steadily through the night. For a moment, I stood there unsure what to do next. Going back to the airport felt pointless, and I certainly wasn't going to sit on a bench there all night waiting for a phone call that hadn't come in the first place. So I walked a little farther down the road until I saw the glow of another sign ahead. Motel. It was the kind of place travelers use when they only need a bed and a locked door for the night. The office window was lit and a small bell rang when I pushed open the door. A middle-aged man behind the counter looked up from a small television. "Evening," he said. "Evening," I replied. "You need a room?" "Yes, just for the night." He slid a registration card toward me and handed over a pen. I filled out my name and address, slowly, the letters of Eleanor Mitchell looking strangely formal under the fluorescent light. "Holiday travel?" he asked casually. "Yes." He nodded in the sympathetic way strangers sometimes do when they don't want to ask too many questions. "Well," he said, passing me a key card, "Room 18, end of the building." I thanked him, rolled my suitcase across the parking lot, and found the door marked with a faded number. Inside the room was simple but clean. A narrow bed, a small desk, a television mounted on the wall. The heater clicked softly when I turned it on, filling the quiet space with a faint, mechanical hum. I set my suitcase beside the bed and sat down slowly. For the first time since arriving in Denver, the stillness settled fully around me. No airport announcements, no passing cars. Just the quiet of a motel room on Thanksgiving night. I took off my coat and laid it across the chair by the window. Outside the parking lot, lights reflected faintly against the dark glass. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and allowed myself to think. For years, helping Daniel had been as natural as breathing. When he and Tracy bought their house, I co-signed the mortgage because they needed a stronger credit history. When Nathan started preschool, I helped with the tuition. When Lily needed braces, I wrote the check without thinking twice. There were smaller things too, car repairs, school supplies, unexpected expenses that always seemed to appear at the worst possible moments. Daniel never demanded the help outright, but over time he had grown comfortable asking, and I had grown comfortable saying yes. That was what mothers did, or at least that was what I had always believed. I leaned back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling. At some point I realized the television was still off and the room was completely silent. Even the heater had settled into a steady rhythm that barely registered anymore. My phone sat on the bedside table. For a moment I wondered if I should send a message. Just something simple. I arrived. But that thought faded quickly. Because Daniel already knew I was coming. I had told him my flight number. He had told me he would pick me up. And yet the evening had unfolded exactly the way the photo suggested it would. Dinner had happened. Without me. Eventually, fatigue pulled at my eyelids. I turned off the bedside lamp and let the room fall into darkness. Sleep came slowly. My mind kept replaying small details from the day: the sound of the airplane wheels touching the runway, the warmth of the diner, the soft glow of the phone screen in my hands. And that photo. Full house, full hearts. Sometime during the night, I finally drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, pale sunlight filtered through the thin motel curtains. For a few seconds after waking, I felt that strange disorientation that comes with sleeping in unfamiliar places. The ceiling above me looked different. The quiet felt heavier. Then I remembered where I was. My phone buzzed on the bedside table. I reached for it. Daniel's name filled the screen. A text message. I opened it slowly. "Mom, I just saw your messages." There was a pause before the next line appeared. "I thought your flight was tomorrow." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Another message followed quickly. "We got our days mixed up. Sorry about that." I read the words again. Then again. The explanation sat there on the screen, neat and simple. For a moment I wondered if his phone had simply been sitting somewhere on the kitchen counter the night before, buried beneath the noise of Thanksgiving dinner. Just a misunderstanding, just the wrong day. I imagined Daniel typing it quickly while standing in the kitchen, maybe while Tracy rinsed dishes from the night before. Maybe the kids were still asleep upstairs. Maybe the house still smelled like turkey and stuffing. For a moment I almost believed it. Almost. But then the memory of that photograph returned: the full table, the raised glasses, the caption written with such certainty. It hadn't looked like a dinner waiting for someone else to arrive. It had looked like a dinner already complete. I set the phone down on the bedside table and sat quietly for several minutes. The heater clicked softly again. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere in the parking lot. And slowly, calmly, something inside me settled. I picked up the phone once more and read Daniel's message one last time. Then I placed it back on the table. By the time I stood up and walked toward the small window of the motel room, I had already made my decision. I was not going to Daniel's house. Not today. Not after this. Instead, I would finish what I had come here to understand, and then I would go home. I stood by the small motel window for a long time after making that decision. The morning sky over the parking lot was pale and colorless, the kind of thin winter light that made everything look quieter than it really was. A couple was loading suitcases into the back of a car. Somewhere down the row of rooms, a door slammed shut and an engine started. Life was continuing as if nothing unusual had happened. And in a way that was true, because the realization I had reached in that small motel room wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't come with anger or tears. It arrived quietly. I dressed slowly, folded my sweater into my suitcase, and checked out at the motel office a little before 9. The same man from the night before was behind the counter. He looked up from a newspaper as I placed the keycard on the desk. "Heading out already?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Safe travels. Thank you." Outside, the air was colder than the night before. I pulled my coat tighter around me and called a taxi back to the airport. The drive back to the terminal took about 15 minutes. As the car pulled up in front of the glass doors, the airport looked almost identical to the way it had the evening before, travelers moving in and out with rolling suitcases, families greeting one another, announcements echoing through the building. Only this time I wasn't waiting for anyone. Inside, I checked the departure board until I found the next flight heading toward Madison. There was one leaving just after noon. I bought the ticket without hesitating. While I waited near the gate, my phone remained quiet. Daniel didn't call again. Another message appeared sometime mid-morning. "Let me know when you get in." I read it once and placed the phone back into my purse. He didn't ask where I had spent the night. He didn't ask if I had eaten. Just that simple request. "Let me know when you get in." Nearby, a little boy sat cross-legged on the floor, building a small tower with toy blocks, while his mother watched from the chair beside him. Every time the tower fell, he laughed and started again. I watched them for a moment before opening my purse. There was something I needed to do before I boarded the plane. I found a small notepad tucked inside the side pocket, the one I usually carried for grocery lists, and a pen. For a minute, I simply stared at the blank page. Then I began to write. The letter wasn't long. Dear Olivia, I hope your semester is going well. I know nursing school keeps you busy, but I wanted you to know how proud I am of the work you're doing. There are moments in life when we realize things about our families that take time to understand. When that happens, it's important to remember the people who show us kindness without expecting anything in return. You've always been one of those people for me. Thank you for every message, every photo of your cat, every little reminder that someone out there is thinking of me. I hope we can spend some time together soon. Love, Grandma Eleanor. I folded the page carefully. Olivia lived in Providence, now finishing the last year of her nursing program. We didn't see each other often, but she called sometimes, usually late in the evening after long study sessions, just to ask how I was doing. It was a small thing, but small things have a way of revealing who truly remembers you. I walked to a small gift shop near the gate and bought a simple envelope. Then I addressed it slowly, writing out her dorm address from memory. There was a mailbox near the coffee stand across the terminal. I dropped the letter inside. For the first time since arriving in Denver, I felt something loosen slightly in my chest. Not relief exactly, just clarity. When the boarding announcement came, I joined the line of passengers moving slowly toward the jet bridge. No one in that line knew anything about the evening before. To them, I was just another traveler heading home after a holiday visit, and perhaps that was the simplest way to think about it. The flight back to Wisconsin was uneventful. I spent most of the time looking out the window as the plane carried us over long stretches of clouds and snow-covered farmland. By the time we landed in Madison, the afternoon sun had already begun its slow descent behind the gray November sky. Driving home from the airport felt oddly peaceful. The streets near my neighborhood were quiet, many houses still decorated with small Thanksgiving wreaths on their doors. When I pulled into my driveway, my house looked exactly the way I had left it 2 days earlier. Still, waiting. Inside, the familiar scent of wood polish and old books greeted me. I set my suitcase near the hallway closet and hung my coat on its usual hook by the door. For a while, I simply walked through the house, the kitchen, the living room, the small sunroom where I liked to read in the mornings. Everything was exactly as it had been before I left, and yet something inside me had shifted. Eventually, I went into my bedroom and knelt beside the lower drawer of my dresser. Inside that drawer was a small metal box where I kept old documents, bank papers, insurance policies, the mortgage records from years ago. I opened the drawer slowly. Then I pulled the box toward me and lifted the lid. Beneath the top layer of papers, another folder waited quietly, the one that held the records of every financial decision I had made for my son over the past decade. I rested my hand on the edge of the folder, and for the first time in a very long while, I decided it was time to look through it. For a long moment, I simply sat on the floor beside the open drawer, staring at the folder in my hands. The house was quiet in the way it always was in the late afternoon. The sun had already begun sliding lower behind the bare branches outside the bedroom window, and the soft orange light stretched across the carpet beside me. I hadn't opened this folder in years. Not because I had forgotten what was inside, but because until recently I had never felt the need to look back. I pulled the first stack of papers out slowly and laid them on the bed. Bank transfers, mortgage documents, receipts, the story of the last decade of my life, written in numbers and signatures. At the top of the stack was the mortgage co-signing agreement. I remembered that day clearly. Daniel and Tracy had found the house they wanted, a modest 2-story place outside Denver with a small backyard and a maple tree in front. Nathan had been only 3 years old at the time, and Lily wasn't even born yet. They had been so excited. "We just need a little help qualifying," Daniel had said over the phone. Just a little help. His credit history hadn't been long enough yet. The bank needed another name on the paperwork. So I signed. Not because anyone forced me to, but because that was what mothers did when their children were starting families of their own. I slid that document aside and picked up the next. Preschool tuition payments. Nathan's name appeared again and again in the records from those years. Daniel and Tracy had both been working long hours then, and childcare had been expensive. Just until things stabilized, Daniel had told me. I didn't question it. Every few months, another check, another transfer. It never felt like a burden at the time. Helping felt natural. I moved to the next set of papers. Medical bills. Lily's orthodontic treatment had taken nearly 2 years. I remembered the first time Tracy mentioned it during a phone call. The insurance doesn't cover most of it, she had said, sounding frustrated. 2 weeks later, I had mailed a check to the clinic. I hadn't even told Daniel I was doing it. It was easier that way. Further down in the folder were smaller things. Car repairs, school activity fees, one invoice from a roofing company after a summer storm damaged part of their house. Each one had seemed temporary. Each one had seemed like the kind of problem families solve together. I sat quietly on the edge of the bed and looked at the neat columns of numbers across the papers. For years I had never added them up, not because I was afraid of the total, but because the total had never mattered. When you help your children, you don't keep score. You simply help. Still, something about the quiet of the house that afternoon made me reach for the calculator sitting on the small desk near the window. I carried it back to the bed and began entering the numbers one by one. Mortgage support, preschool, braces, emergency repairs, occasional transfers that Daniel had always promised to repay someday. The calculator screen grew steadily larger with each entry. I wasn't rushing. In fact, I moved slowly, checking each number twice before entering the next. Outside, the light faded further, turning the room a softer shade of gray. When I finally pressed the last number, the total settled on the screen. I stared at it for several seconds, not shocked, just thoughtful. It wasn't a small amount, but it also wasn't the number itself that held my attention. What held my attention was the realization that I had never once asked Daniel how any of these things had worked out afterward. Had the preschool helped Nathan get ahead in school? Had the roofing repair prevented further damage? Had the orthodontics given Lily the smile Tracy had hoped for? I realized sitting there with the calculator in my hands that most of the time I had never followed up at all. The help had simply become part of the background of their lives, like electricity in the walls. Always there, rarely noticed. I set the calculator down on the bed and leaned back against the headboard. The folder remained open beside me, the papers spread neatly across the blanket. For a long time I said nothing, because anger wasn't what I felt. What I felt instead was something quieter, something closer to understanding. Daniel hadn't suddenly changed the night I stood in that airport. People rarely change that quickly. More often, relationships shift slowly over years, almost too gradually to notice while they're happening. A favor becomes an expectation. Help becomes routine. Routine becomes invisible, and eventually the person providing that help becomes invisible too. I picked up one of the earlier documents again, the mortgage co-signing agreement, and studied the signatures near the bottom of the page. Daniel's handwriting looked younger then, less rushed. I wondered briefly if he even remembered that day as clearly as I did, or if, like so many of the other things in this folder, it had simply blended into the background of his life. I placed the document back onto the bed with the others and closed the folder halfway. The house had grown darker now. Soon I would need to turn on the lamps. But before doing that, I sat there for another minute, listening to the quiet rooms around me, and slowly another thought began to take shape. Not a decision. Not yet. But the beginning of one. The next morning the house was still quiet when I woke up. For a few seconds I lay there staring at the ceiling, letting the calm settle around me. Outside, a thin layer of frost clung to the lawn, turning the grass pale under the early winter light. The folder from the night before was still on the bedside table. I had closed it before going to sleep, but the weight of the papers inside it lingered in my mind. Not as anger, not even as disappointment, just clarity. I dressed slowly, choosing one of my usual sweaters and the dark coat I wore whenever I needed to go into town, the kind of coat that had become almost like a uniform over the years, something dependable, something that made small errands feel organized and purposeful. Downstairs, I made a cup of coffee and stood by the kitchen window while it cooled. The neighborhood was beginning to wake up. A school bus stopped at the corner. A man walked his dog past the mailbox at the end of my driveway. Everything looked exactly as it always had. But I knew the morning would be different. After finishing the coffee, I placed the folder carefully into my bag and drove to the bank. The building sat on the same corner it had occupied for more than 20 years, a modest brick structure with tall windows and a row of small trees planted along the sidewalk. I had opened my first account there not long after moving to Madison. Back then, Daniel had been in middle school. Inside, the bank smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, the quiet, orderly scent of a place built around numbers and signatures. A young teller greeted me as I stepped up to the counter. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." She glanced at the screen in front of her. "How can we help you today, Ms. Mitchell?" "I'd like to speak with someone about updating a few things on my accounts." "Of course," she said. "One moment." A few minutes later, I was led into a small office with a glass wall that looked out toward the lobby. The man who joined me introduced himself as Mr. Larson, a financial advisor who had worked there for several years. He shook my hand politely and took a seat across from me. "What can we do for you today, Mrs. Mitchell?" I opened my bag and placed the folder on the desk. "I need to review several automatic transfers connected to my account," I said. He nodded and turned his computer screen slightly toward himself. "Of course. Let's take a look." As he typed, the quiet clicking of the keyboard filled the small room. After a moment, he paused. "I see a number of recurring transfers," he said carefully. "Some of them have been active for quite a while." "Yes," I replied. He turned the screen slightly so I could see the list. There they were: monthly transfers, occasional payments, a handful of scheduled deposits connected to an account in Denver, Daniel's account. I studied the screen for a few seconds, then I spoke. "I'd like to stop these." Mr. Larson looked up briefly, not surprised, just attentive. "All of them, yes." He nodded once and began clicking through the settings. "Those changes can take effect immediately," he said. "Any pending transfers will be canceled as well." "That's fine." For the next few minutes, the two of us worked quietly through the list. One by one, the transfers disappeared from the system. Preschool support had ended years ago, of course, but several smaller payments still remained, the kind that had continued quietly in the background long after the original reasons had faded. When the last one was removed, Mr. Larson leaned back slightly in his chair. "All right," he said. "Those are taken care of." I nodded. "There's one more thing." He waited. "Years ago, I signed a limited power of attorney document allowing my son to access certain financial records connected to my account." Mr. Larson checked the file again. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I see that here." The document had been signed during the period when Daniel and Tracy were applying for their mortgage. At the time, it had simply seemed like another piece of paperwork. Something temporary, something helpful. "I'd like to revoke that authorization," I said. He didn't ask for an explanation. Instead, he reached for a form inside the drawer beside his desk and slid it across the table. "This document will cancel the previous authorization," he said. "Once signed, your son will no longer have access to the account information." I picked up the pen. For a brief moment, my hand rested above the paper, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood that this small signature represented the closing of a door that had been open for a very long time. Then I signed my name, Eleanor Mitchell. Mr. Larson reviewed the form and added it to the file. "That will take effect immediately," he said. "Thank you." He stood and walked me back toward the lobby. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, now reflecting softly off the polished floor tiles. Customers moved quietly between the counters, speaking in low voices. Just another ordinary day at the bank. At the door, Mr. Larson shook my hand again. "If you need anything else, Mrs. Mitchell, please don't hesitate to reach out. I will." Outside, the cold air felt sharper than it had earlier that morning. I pulled my coat a little tighter and walked toward my car. The street looked exactly as it always did. Traffic passing steadily through the intersection, people carrying coffee cups along the sidewalk, the familiar rhythm of a small city moving through its day. But as I sat behind the wheel and looked back once at the bank building, I realized something important. For the first time in many years, a quiet boundary had finally been drawn, and I had drawn it myself. 2 days after my visit to the bank, I made another appointment. This one was with a lawyer. The office sat on the second floor of an older building near the courthouse downtown. I had walked past it many times over the years without ever needing to go inside, until now. The waiting room was quiet when I arrived. A bookshelf filled one wall and a soft ticking clock hung above a framed photograph of the Madison skyline. A receptionist greeted me and asked me to take a seat. "Mr. Whitaker will be with you shortly." I nodded and sat down with my purse folded neatly in my lap. Outside the window, people moved steadily along the sidewalk, their coats pulled tight against the cold. Life in the city carried on in its usual rhythm. For the first time in a long while, I felt calm. Not the fragile calm that comes after an argument, but the steady calm that comes when a decision has already begun forming inside you. A few minutes later, the office door opened, and a tall man in his 50s stepped into the waiting room. "Mrs. Mitchell." "Yes, I'm Thomas Whitaker. Please come in." His office was lined with folders and legal books stacked neatly across several shelves. He gestured toward a chair across from his desk while he sat down and opened a notepad. "How can I help you today?" I placed my purse beside the chair and folded my hands together. "I'd like to review my estate planning documents." He nodded immediately. "That's a good idea for anyone your age," he said with a polite smile. "Do you currently have a will?" "Yes," I replied. "But it's old." "How old?" "Almost 15 years. That had been shortly after Daniel and Tracy moved into their house. At the time, the plan had seemed simple. Everything would eventually pass to Daniel. The house, my retirement accounts, the savings I had built over the years working as a school administrator. It had all felt like the natural path of things. Mr. Whitaker leaned back slightly in his chair. "Family situations change over time," he said carefully. "Updating a will is very common." "Yes," I said, "they do." He waited a moment before continuing. "Tell me a little about your family." "I have one son," I said, "Daniel. He lives in Colorado with his wife and 2 children. Grandchildren," he said with a small nod. "Yes, and your relationship with them." I thought briefly about Nathan building towers with toy blocks and Lily's braces. "They're good children," I said simply. Mr. Whitaker nodded and made a small note on his pad. "Are there any other family members you would like included in your estate plan?" "Yes." He looked up. "My granddaughter Olivia." "Daniel's daughter." "No," I said. "My daughter-in-law's niece. She's in nursing school right now." He paused for a moment, clearly organizing the information in his mind. "And you're close with her, yes?" He nodded slowly. "That's certainly something we can include." For a moment, the room grew quiet again. Then he folded his hands together. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said gently, "there are several ways to structure an estate plan. Some people simply update their will. Others choose to create a trust. I'd like to create a trust," I said. He didn't seem surprised. "A trust can provide more control over how assets are managed and distributed," he explained. "It can also help avoid probate and simplify things later. That sounds appropriate." He began outlining the details, the structure, the responsibilities of a trustee, the way assets could be transferred into the trust over time. I listened carefully, asking a few questions when necessary, but for the most part, the decision had already been made before I walked into the office. After nearly an hour of discussion, Mr. Whitaker set down his pen. "All right," he said, "let's talk about how you'd like to structure the beneficiaries." He looked at me over the edge of his glasses. "How would you like your estate distributed?" The answer came more easily than I expected. "I would like my assets placed into a trust," I said. He nodded. "And the primary beneficiary, Olivia." He studied my face for a moment, not questioning the decision, simply confirming it. "And your son?" I paused. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the words to be clear. "My son will not be a beneficiary of the trust." Mr. Whitaker wrote that down carefully. "And who will serve as trustee?" he asked. "I would like your office to serve as the trustee until Olivia finishes school," I said. "After that, the responsibility can transfer to her." He nodded. "That arrangement is quite common." We continued reviewing the details for another half hour. The house, my retirement accounts, the savings I had built over the years, everything would be transferred into the trust. When the meeting finally ended, Mr. Whitaker closed the folder in front of him. "I'll begin drafting the documents this week," he said. "Once they're ready, we'll schedule another meeting for signatures." I stood and shook his hand. "Thank you." "You're welcome, Mrs. Mitchell." When I stepped back outside onto the sidewalk, the afternoon light had begun to fade behind the courthouse buildings. Cars moved slowly along the street. People hurried past with briefcases and grocery bags. The world continued, as it always had. But as I walked toward my car, I felt something settle quietly inside me. For the first time since that evening at the airport, the future no longer felt uncertain. A decision had been made, and with it, the direction of everything that would follow. A week passed after my meeting with the lawyer before anything unusual happened. Life in the house returned to its familiar rhythm. Mornings were quiet, afternoons slow, and evenings filled with the soft ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Daniel never mentioned the bank transfers stopping. Not at first. There were no messages asking if something had changed, no calls, wondering whether a payment had been delayed. For several days, my phone remained almost completely silent. That silence didn't surprise me as much as it once might have. Instead, I found myself thinking about someone else. Olivia. The letter I had mailed from the airport in Denver should have reached her by now. Providence was a long way from Wisconsin, but not so far that a simple envelope couldn't travel there in a few days. I pictured her the way I had last seen her nearly a year earlier, sitting cross-legged on the couch during a short visit textbook stacked beside her while she talked about anatomy classes and long nights at the hospital. She had always spoken about nursing with a kind of quiet determination. Helping people mattered to her. That alone had always made me proud. The call came on a Thursday evening. I was in the kitchen rinsing a teacup when the phone began to ring on the counter. For a moment, I almost ignored it, assuming it was another telemarketer. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw Olivia's name. I answered immediately. "Hello, Grandma Eleanor." Her voice sounded exactly the same as I remembered, warm, a little breathless, as if she had hurried somewhere before making the call. "Yes, Olivia, I got your letter today." For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she added quietly, "Is everything okay?" I dried my hands on a towel and sat down at the kitchen table. "Yes," I said, "everything is fine. Your letter sounded different." I smiled faintly. "I suppose it did." There was a pause on the line. "I've been thinking about visiting you for a while," she said. "Classes are lighter this week, and I still have a few days before my next hospital rotation. That sounds busy." "It is," she laughed softly. "But I could take the train tomorrow evening." The idea arrived so suddenly that for a moment I didn't know what to say. "You don't have to do that," I said gently. "I know," she replied. Another small pause followed. "But I'd like to." Something about the sincerity in her voice settled the question immediately. "All right," I said. "I'll meet you at the station." The train from Providence to Madison required a transfer in Chicago, so Olivia's journey took most of the following day. By late afternoon, the sky had already begun turning the soft gray color that often comes before an early winter sunset. I arrived at the station a few minutes before the train was scheduled to arrive. The platform was busy with travelers moving in small clusters, students carrying backpacks, couples pulling wheeled suitcases, families waiting near the railing. I stood a little apart from the crowd, my coat pulled close against the wind that swept down the tracks. When the train finally pulled in, the familiar screech of brakes echoed beneath the metal roof of the station. Passengers began stepping down onto the platform one by one. For a moment, I scanned the crowd without seeing her. Then a young woman stepped out from one of the middle cars with a large canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Her dark hair was pulled back into the same loose ponytail she had worn during her last visit. "Olivia." She spotted me almost immediately. Her face lit up with that same open smile she had carried since she was a teenager. Grandma Eleanor. Her voice cut through the noise of the station. I lifted one hand in greeting. She hurried toward me, weaving through the small crowd of passengers still stepping down from the train. Up close, she looked a little more tired than I remembered, the kind of tired that comes from long study nights and early morning classes, but the warmth in her eyes hadn't changed at all. "You came all the way out here to meet me," she said. "Of course I did." She laughed softly. "I would have found my way." "I know." For a second, we both stood there looking at each other. Then Olivia dropped her bag onto the platform and stepped forward. Her arms wrapped around me before I had time to say anything else. I held her just as tightly. The station noise faded into the background, the rumble of the train engine, the murmur of travelers moving past us, the distant announcements echoing through the building. For that brief moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the simple warmth of the hug, and the quiet feeling that after everything that had happened in the past few weeks, I was finally standing beside someone who had truly come to see me. Olivia stayed with me for 3 days. The house felt different during that time. Not louder exactly, but warmer. She filled the quiet spaces with stories from her classes, small observations from the hospital where she trained, and the kind of laughter that only appeared when someone felt completely comfortable. On the second evening, we sat together in the living room with mugs of tea while the early winter darkness settled outside. "You always keep this house so peaceful," she said, glancing around the room. "I suppose I've had a lot of time to practice," I replied. She smiled. We didn't talk about my letter that night. Not directly, but I noticed the way she studied me occasionally, as if trying to understand what had prompted it. The answer would come soon enough. 2 mornings later, Olivia left on the early train back to Chicago, where she would continue on to Providence. I walked her to the platform just as I had when she arrived. This time the hug felt different, still warm, still genuine, but quieter somehow, as if both of us understood that something important had shifted between us. When I returned home, the house felt calm again. I spent most of the afternoon in the kitchen preparing a simple soup, letting the slow rhythm of chopping vegetables and stirring the pot settle my thoughts. The doorbell rang just before sunset. At first, I assumed it might be a delivery driver, but when I opened the door, I found Tracy standing on the front porch. She looked tired, not physically tired in the way Olivia had after traveling, but tense, the kind of tension that settles around someone's eyes when they've spent too many hours thinking about something they don't fully understand. "Hello, Eleanor," she said. Her voice carried a careful politeness. "Tracy," I replied. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I stepped aside and opened the door wider. "You'd better come in. It's cold." She walked into the entryway, glancing briefly around the house as if confirming that everything looked exactly the way she remembered. "Daniel said you stopped the transfers," she said after a moment. I closed the door behind her. "Yes." Her lips pressed together. "He noticed when the mortgage payment came through differently this month." "I imagine he would." Tracy removed her gloves slowly. "You didn't say anything?" "No." Her eyes searched my face. "We thought something might be wrong. I'm sure you did." The conversation hung in the air for a few seconds. Finally, she spoke again. "Daniel said you've been upset since Thanksgiving." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked toward the living room and gestured toward one of the chairs. "You're welcome to sit if you like." She remained standing. "I didn't come here to sit," she said. "That's all right." The silence between us grew heavier. Finally, Tracy exhaled. "Look, Eleanor, if this is about the airport, Daniel already explained what happened." "Yes," I said quietly. "He did. He thought your flight was the next day. It was just a mix-up." Her tone carried the confident certainty of someone repeating an explanation that had already been practiced several times. I met her gaze calmly. "Did he also explain the photograph?" She hesitated. "What photograph? The one he posted during dinner?" Her expression shifted slightly. "That was just a picture of the kids." "It was a picture of Thanksgiving dinner," I said. Tracy crossed her arms. "People post pictures all the time." "Yes." And the caption said, "Full house, full hearts." The words seemed to linger in the room for a moment. Tracy's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're reading too much into that." "Perhaps." She shook her head. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. Am I? Yes, she said firmly. It was a misunderstanding. Daniel feels terrible about it. I studied her expression carefully. Not angry, not cruel, just defensive. I'm not angry with Daniel, I said. Her eyebrows lifted. Then why did you stop helping? The question came out sharper than the rest of her words. For a moment, I considered how to answer. Then I chose the simplest truth, because I realized something. And what's that? That help can quietly turn into expectation if it lasts long enough. Tracy looked at me as if I had spoken a language she didn't quite recognize. We never expected anything she said. Perhaps not at first. She let out a short breath of frustration. So what now? You're just cutting Daniel off. I'm setting a boundary. That's the same thing. No, I said calmly. It isn't. Her expression hardened. You know he's under a lot of pressure right now. I'm sure he is. The kids have expenses. The house I'm aware of, the house I interrupted gently. Tracy stopped speaking. For a moment we stood there facing each other across the living room. Then she said quietly, Daniel thinks you're punishing him. I shook my head. I'm not punishing anyone. Then what are you doing? I'm changing how things work. She studied my face again as if searching for some sign of anger she could argue against, but there was none. Finally, she picked up her gloves from the table. Well, she said stiffly, I suppose we'll have to figure things out on our own. Yes, I said. I believe you will. She walked toward the front door without another word. I followed a few steps behind and opened it for her. The evening air had grown colder, and the first faint snowflakes had begun drifting down through the streetlight above the driveway. Tracy paused briefly on the porch. Then she looked back at me. I hope you know what you're doing. I do. She held my gaze for another moment. Then she turned and walked down the path toward her car. A moment later, the engine started, and just like that, she was gone. The phone call came 2 days after Tracy's visit. It was early evening. Outside, the snow from the night before still clung to the branches of the maple tree in my front yard. I was sitting in the sunroom with a small blanket over my knees, reading a few pages from a book I had started weeks earlier but never finished. When the phone began to ring, I already knew who it would be. Daniel. I let it ring twice before answering. Hello? There was a short pause on the other end of the line. Mom. His voice sounded slightly tense the way it used to sound when he was younger and unsure how a conversation might unfold. Yes, Daniel. I heard Tracy stopped by your house. She did. Another pause. I guess we should talk. That seems reasonable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear the faint echo of movement on his end of the call, perhaps the sound of a chair shifting across a kitchen floor or a cabinet door closing. Finally, he said, Why didn't you tell me you were upset I wasn't upset? I replied. You stopped the transfers, Mom. Yes. That's not exactly nothing. I closed the book in my lap and rested my hands on the cover. You noticed the payments quickly? I said. Of course I did. The mortgage account changed. That makes sense. Daniel exhaled slowly. Look, if this is about Thanksgiving, I already explained what happened. I know. I thought your flight was the next day. Yes, and Tracy told me you mentioned that photo. I didn't think it mattered. I looked out the window toward the quiet street. It mattered to me. Another pause settled between us. I didn't mean for any of that to happen, Daniel said. I believe you. Then why are you doing this? His voice carried genuine confusion now. I thought carefully before answering. Because I realized something while I was sitting in that airport. And what's that? That sometimes the way we help the people we love slowly changes the way they see us. Daniel didn't respond right away. I've helped you for many years, I continued gently, and I did it willingly. I never kept score, I know that, but somewhere along the way, those things became part of the background of your life. That's not fair, he said quietly. It's not meant to be fair, I replied. It's meant to be honest. I heard him sigh again. So what now, he asked. Now you and Tracy will build your life the way families usually do, and you're just stepping back. Yes. The words felt calm as they left my mouth. Daniel was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "Tracy told me you're talking to a lawyer." "I am." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm organizing my affairs." "You mean your estate?" "Yes. And where do I fit into that?" I looked down at my hands for a moment. "You don't." The quiet that followed was heavier than anything else in the conversation. "You're serious?" he said eventually. "Yes." "After everything?" "Yes." His voice hardened slightly. "You're giving everything to someone else, to Olivia. That doesn't make any sense." "It makes perfect sense. She's not even your granddaughter." "No," I said gently. "She's someone who remembers to visit." Daniel didn't respond. I could almost hear him thinking through the implications. Finally, he spoke again. "So that's it." "That's it." The conversation ended a few minutes later. Not with shouting, not with accusations, just with a quiet understanding that something fundamental between us had changed. After I hung up the phone, the house felt unusually peaceful, the kind of peace that arrives after a long conversation finally reaches its natural conclusion. The following week, I prepared a small package for Olivia. Inside the box, I placed a simple leather notebook, something I thought she might use during her hospital rotations, along with a handwritten note. The note was short. "Dear Olivia, I hope your classes are going well. I know the work you're doing is difficult, but it matters more than you realize. Inside this package is something small to keep with you during your long shifts. Sometimes the quiet moments we give to other people are the ones that stay with them the longest. Take care of yourself as well as you take care of others. Love, Grandma Eleanor." I sealed the box and carried it to the post office that afternoon. When I returned home, the evening light was beginning to fade again. For a while, I sat at the kitchen table, watching the soft shadows move across the floor. Then I remembered something, a small message I had written earlier in the day. I picked up my phone and sent it. The message was simple. "Next Thanksgiving, buy your own pie." I stared at the screen for a moment after pressing send. Then I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair. If you've listened to this story all the way to the end, I'd love to know what you think. Was Eleanor right to step away after everything that happened, or would you have handled things differently? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this make you reflect on family boundaries and the quiet choices that shape our lives, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The house was quiet again, but this time the quiet felt different. Not empty, not lonely, just free. Because sometimes, the most important thing we can do for the people we love is finally learn when to stop buying the pie.